Okay, hi everyone, welcome back to another lecture on an essay question. For this time, we are going through macro, specifically macro goals, macro policies. And you see this question over here, right? Explain why government cannot solely rely on automatic stabilizers, and instead uses discretionary fiscal policy to address the concerns of an economic recession. That's the part A. I'll go through more on that part A. Part B I won't go through because it's a relatively common, straightforward policy question. But generally, when it comes to part B, discuss whether demand management policies are more important than supply side policies in attaining inclusive economic growth for an economy experiencing recession. So here, right, I'll just briefly go through the part B so you all know what to write. So demand management, usually we're talking about our fiscal policy or our monetary policy, and then our supply side policy is simply our supply side policy, right? So very simply, you just explain how each of the policies work, and then in your conclusion, how each of the policies work to attain inclusive economic growth. Okay, so your endpoint should be inclusive economic growth, and in your evaluation, I think very clear cut whether or not demand management policies or supply side policies are more important ultimately depends on maybe the type of economy that you're in. It depends on the reason of the recession to begin with. We need to tackle the idea of recession, right? If the recession is due to an AD thing, a demand management policy is makes more sense to do. If it's due to a supply side issue, then a supply side policy will probably make more sense. So that's just generally for part B. It's a relatively straightforward question, but I'll go through part A because there's an interesting concept that we don't deal with usually, and that's the idea of automatic stabilizers. Okay, so when I read this, right, Brazil's GDP contracted by 3.6% and led to calls from policymakers to use discretionary fiscal policies to stimulate the economy. So actually here the preamble doesn't tell us much, right? So when I look at part A, straight away, right, I need to know, to be able to do part A, I need to know what automatic stabilizers are. I need to know what a recession is. So when I talk about a recession, it is always talking about 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth, right, or more, right? And then my automatic stabilizers, usually we have progressive tax systems or transfer payments. So my key argument one, when I want to argue why they cannot rely solely on automatic stabilizers and why we have to use discretionary fiscal policy, right, you realize that regardless, to get our content marks, we have to explain how each of them work and then explain why we cannot solely rely on automatic stabilizers. So my KA1 will be explaining how automatic stabilizers work, right? So for automatic stabilizers, we need to understand that the focus on it, right, for automatic stabilizers, what they help to do in a recession is to dampen the fall in AD. And hence the fall in real GDP, right? So I'll give examples of what automatic stabilizers are to aid me in an explanation. So let's say, for example, if I choose to talk about progressive tax systems, right? So if I have a progressive tax system, what this means is that the rich are taxed more proportionately, are taxed more than the poor / the lower income. So how this works is basically, we need to understand that when there's a recession, right, what happens to the income of households? The income of households falls, right? And when the income of household falls, more citizens actually fall into lower tax brackets. Right? That's how our progressive tax system is meant to work, right? It's meant to aid the people who might be suffering from a fall in income, from low income. And this is literally the design of a progressive tax system, which means that the fall in their tax payments from the citizens, right, they'll have to pay less taxes. The fall in tax payments are meant to be greater than their fall in income, so that the take-home income is actually, it doesn't decrease that significantly. So this helps to decrease the extent to which their purchasing power falls, the citizens' purchasing power falls, and hence AD falls by a smaller extent. Okay, so basically it cushions the impact of a recession. And if you look at it very clearly, we have to be very clear. When we say that the AD falls by a smaller extent, right? We need to realize, right, that this progressive tax system, right, that this fall in income cannot be the initial cause for my fall in AD. Okay, when I say AD falls by a smaller extent, this is when I'm referring to the downward multiplier effect, when my AD falls by multiplied times due to a fall in an initial fall in AD, right? But we know that an initial fall in AD cannot be due to a change in income levels, because that's very counterintuitive. If you think about it, when I draw, let's say, my ADAS diagram, right? So I have if I draw my ADAS diagram here, we AS, AD, YF, Y naught. So we measure how our household incomes by the GDP, correct? So it doesn't make sense for our GDP, for our AD to fall because there's a change in income. Because in a sense, that's a very circular argument, right? We say that a fall in real GDP leads to a fall in income. But then if we say that a fall in income leads to a initial fall in AD, which leads to a fall in real GDP, which leads to another fall in income, right? You realize you're missing something here. There has to be a reason for the initial fall in income first, because by right, according to our ADS model, right, if the RGDP doesn't change, our income shouldn't be changing for no reason. So you have to go look back at the causal link. So here when I say AD falls by a smaller extent, I'm talking about the downward multiplier part of it after the initial fall in AD. Why do I not have to explain the initial fall in AD here? Is because they've already given me the background knowledge that it's a recession. So there's a reason that the AD is already falling. But I'm just talking about the cushioning of the impact of the AD fall. Okay, the second one, right, I'll talk about transfer payments. When I look at transfer payments, right, it helps to reduce the aim of it is to help to reduce extent of fall in AD. How? You look at it very simply, right? When there's transfer payments, maybe in the form of unemployment benefits, okay? When there are transfer payments, maybe in the form of unemployment benefits, how it works is that when, let's say, there's a recession, there's greater cyclical unemployment, greater demand deficient unemployment, the same things, right? There will be citizens who are losing their jobs within the country itself. And because there are more unemployed people, increase in unemployment, more citizens would be eligible to receive transfer payments, right? In the form of unemployment payments. And hence, because they are receiving some form of money in the form of unemployment benefits, right? You realize that the fall in purchasing power or the fall in disposable income is reduced. And because it is reduced, it leads to a smaller fall in consumption as a result of the recession, right? And hence it mitigates the extent to which AD decreases. But you realize something very, very crucial about these automatic stabilizers. They do not help to bring the country out of a recession. They only serve to reduce or cushion the impact of a recession by cushioning the impact on the fall in AD, right? And the fall in national income. So my key argument too, right? I would focus on discretionary fiscal policies. Here, I would explain expansionary fiscal policy because they really give me the context, the pretext of a recession. Okay, so I have my fiscal policy. So I would simply use the OWL framework, but because this is not a policy question, I won't need to write the L part, right? I just need to write how the policy works. So you would draw the diagram. GPL 0 RGD. And then initially, let's say AS is here, we have YF, and let's say because of the recession, my AD is now here. AD not, and then you talk about the multiplier effect, right? AD1, AD2, AD3, Y1, Y2, and Y3. So the idea behind it is when there's expansionary fiscal policy, so I'll talk about how EFP works, right? Expansionary fiscal policy through the increase in government expenditure, right? Then I explain my multiplier effect in detail and link it to how it brings about actual economic growth, helping to bring the economy out of a recession. Okay, so here, the issue with it, so you can talk about increase in G, you can talk about decrease in taxes, whichever you're more comfortable with. Personally, I prefer increase in G because I think it's more straightforward to explain. But when I talk about this EFP, right, in this question, I would need to write a conclusion in a sense because I talk about automatic stabilizers, the other one I talk about EFP, right, or fiscal policy. So I may not exactly answer the question because the question at its core asks why a government cannot rely solely on automatic stabilizers. So I'll just write a short conclusion based on what we've discussed, right? So there's not really a value judgment here, it's just concluding our arguments. You have to say that automatic stabilizers only serve to dampen or mitigate the negative impacts of a recession, but fiscal policy, or rather expansionary fiscal policy, helps pull the economy, or helps to try to pull the economy out of a recession. And that is precisely why when we are facing a recession in an economy, right, we cannot just rely on automatic stabilizers. They don't help to improve the problem, they just help to reduce the negative impacts of the problem. Okay, I hope this is clear. For part B, I already discussed very briefly what you need to write. It's a relatively straightforward question, so you can go and try that question. If you have any questions about this essay, you can check back with your tutors, okay?